Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Banyatela. Great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, should President Cyril Ramaphosa act fast with appointing a new ambassador to the US? His office said earlier today that he won't be rushing to replace Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, who has been expelled from the US. But what are the consequences of that? The Cape Independence Advocacy Group is another group now that wants to engage with the Trump administration. They want to fundraise and seek diplomatic support for its campaign for the Cape Independence. One of the leaders of that group is Phil Craig. He'll speak to us tonight. Also on the show, how should South Africa navigate these rough diplomatic waters with the US? Pallo Jordan, who is the former chair of the ANC's International Relations Subcommittee, speaks to us. And then later, are the talks between the DRC President Felix Tshisekedi and Rwandan President Paul Kagame going to bear any fruit? We'll be focusing on that before we wrap up the show. But first, my comment. Now, the question really this evening is whether President Cyril Ramaphosa should rush to appoint a new ambassador to the US, and who should the president consider? What are the consequences to the president taking his time around this with consultations and considerations? There are a few names that have been proposed to replace Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. Some people have even suggested that the next ambassador must be chosen along racial lines to appease President Trump's administration. But how much of that decision must be influenced by the hostility from the US? Are we not already compromising ourselves? Or maybe you call it strategic? Here's Vincent Magwenya, the presidency spokesperson, explaining that the president won't be rushing this decision.
The president is not going to rush that process. He's applying his mind. In fact, the president appreciates the numerous messages that he's received. He's been inundated by messages from people volunteering themselves to be posted in Washington, from people making suggestions of individuals to be considered for Washington. However, the president is going to take his time in considering his options with regards to this appointment. The absence of an ambassador in Washington does not mean the absence of engagements with the Trump administration. Equally, just as you have here in South Africa, the US has not appointed an ambassador yet, but we've been able at various levels of government to continue to have engagements with diplomats from the US Embassy. Similarly, in our case, we will continue having engagements with the Trump administration without an ambassador.
I mean, it's already difficult to have conversations with those that are close to Donald Trump or officials from the Trump presidency. How much more when we still don't have someone who's posted in the US? I said the last time when we were talking about this issue on this show that when our government isn't occupying that space and speaking to senior White House officials or advisors to President Trump, other people, and some with nefarious interests not aligned with South African interests, occupy that space. And that doesn't help this government. I think it's clear that our ambassador struggled to find someone in that Trump administration who was willing to give our government an audience. AfriForum and the DA have already claimed that they met senior officials from the White House, even though they don't name them. And our government was only on the verge of securing a meeting just recently before Ambassador Rasool was sent packing. The Cape Independence Advocacy Group is another group now that wants to engage with Trump's administration. And I won't be surprised if they easily get an audience with officials there sooner than our government does. The presidency has criticized the group's intention to visit the US to fundraise and seek diplomatic support for its campaign for the Cape's independence.
Indeed, it is a concern that somebody who's left his own country of birth, has come to South Africa to sow seeds of division, as he has been doing. What is of concern to us is the sort of perpetuation of distortions about our country. So whoever that will welcome him in the United States will need to know that he's not a South African citizen. He is a permanent resident, and he is yet to be naturalized. It is perplexing as to why he's seeking South African citizenship when his views or his intentions are to divide the country.
And you've got to ask what's going on with all these minority groups, right? They seem to feel emboldened by President Trump's attitude towards the South African government, to a point that they somehow, in their right mind, that internal policy differences or constitutional matters can be resolved by other governments. And that just sounds so weird. The president himself has since responded to Rasool's expulsion. Here's what else Vincent Magwenya had to say earlier today.
The president will be engaging the leadership of his party with respect to the expected and envisaged conduct during any form of homecoming rally for Ambassador Rasool. What we are urging is just some kind of restraint, recognizing the kind of prevailing conditions with respect to our diplomatic relationship with the United States. What we would not like to see is further inflaming the situation and creating more difficulties around what is already a challenging situation. And so indeed the president will be having those engagements with his party's leadership in that regard.
It's already a challenging situation, so how do you resolve it? The question we're asking you tonight is, do you understand why the president is not rushing to appoint Rasool's replacement? Does this moment not require the president to be decisive and act quickly? Because we really don't have the luxury of time, do we? Or do you think the president must take his time and think carefully about who is a better option strategically? And who do you think that person is? Andre Snell, maybe? Some people have mentioned Tony Leon. You can share your thoughts with us by sending us a WhatsApp voice note on 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending the voice note from. And please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can send us an X on @FaceTheNation SABC. After the break, we'll speak to Phil Craig, who represents that organization that now wants to go and engage the Trump administration as well. Stay with us here on Face the Nation. Welcome back. President Cyril Ramaphosa might have to deal with yet another twist in the tale of divisions between South Africa and the US. The Cape Independence Advocacy Group says they intend to meet with White House officials to heighten their call for Cape independence. The leader of the group, Phil Craig, says the Presidency, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, and the Western Cape Premier have 7 days to make representations to call a referendum on Cape independence. The group's co-founder, Phil Craig, joins us now for a discussion on this. Phil, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Why are you trying to get the US to intervene in South Africa's internal affairs?
Well, so in the first instance, we're not particularly trying to get the US to intervene in affairs. We are lobbying internationally, just as the ANC itself lobbied internationally when it had the differences with the apartheid government. And fundamentally, we're an organisation that's existed for a number of years. We are fighting for something that is constitutionally permissible, it's legal, and it's something that will improve the lives of the Western Cape people significantly. And ultimately, we've been advocating advocating for Cape independence for a number of time. We've engaged with many of the political organisations, including the Presidency, including the Western Cape Premier. So this isn't something that's new. We want to have a referendum held in the Western Cape to allow the people of the Western Cape themselves to decide democratically, would they like to break away from South Africa? Is that the solution that they collectively want? Or do they want to remain in South Africa? And we have to understand the backdrop of that is, since 1994, the majority of Western Cape voters have never once voted for the ANC, and they've never once been governed at a national level by the government they voted for. So what does Cape Independence deliver? It's not some scheme that's behind the scenes. It's really simple. The people of the Western Cape are not being governed by the party they vote for, and Cape Independence would allow them to be governed by the party they vote for. And I think that should be understandable for anybody in a democracy.
Yeah, and I really think, Phil, there's fundamental differences between the ANC that negotiates with other countries during a time when there's apartheid in this country, and an organization like yourself that's trying to appeal to the conscience or the influence of other countries outside when there is no necessarily persecution. Apartheid was different times. Of course it required that the ANC speak to countries outside.
Well, of course, these things are all very, very subjective. Now, apartheid was worse by a degree, but here we are in the Western Cape. The majority of us are ethnic minorities. We're discriminated against by government legislation. We're suffering chronic unemployment. We have, our lives are getting worse. We're getting poorer. So actually, this isn't something we should just write off because the ANC isn't quite as sinister as the National Party. I happily concede that, but the South African national government has performed absolutely terribly, abysmally, and people are suffering hugely. And we want to find solutions. We want to find democratic solutions. So we don't have to be absolutely as bad as apartheid to say, well, look, hang on a second, there's a problem here, and we're perfectly entitled. And actually, I'll just correct you on something you said. We haven't asked the President and the Premier and the Minister for a referendum in 7 days. What we've said to them is, we want to go overseas. We believe we're constitutionally entitled to do so. But actually, out of fairness and transparency, we're writing to you to say, if you want to suggest that we're not within our legal rights, you've got 7 days to say so. And tellingly, none of them have, because we're not outside of our rights. We're perfectly entitled to go and do this in a democracy. Okay,
so I'm glad you realize that the comparison is quite flawed between what the ANC did during apartheid and what you're doing now. You've just mentioned now that you are facing chronic unemployment. What numbers do you have that we don't have? Because my understanding, having looked at Stats SA, is that unemployment is more rife among the black population and not among the white population. Even if I can take 50,000 white people in the Western Cape against 50,000 black people there, the numbers will tell that specific story. Do you want to share with us the numbers that demonstrate that chronic unemployment amongst white people in the Western Cape?
Well, look, so first of all, and I think this is a really good example of the problems in South Africa, you've instantly gone to black and white. This has got absolutely nothing to do with black and white. I'm talking about the Western Cape people. The Western Cape people, the largest group are coloured, the second largest group are black, and the smallest group are white. So you're making the assumption that we're fighting for Cape independence for white people, but we absolutely aren't. I authored the Western Cape People's Bill, which very clearly talks about those three racial groups all collectively making up the Western Cape people as established in the Western Cape Constitution. And what do we have in the Western Cape? We've got an unemployment rate of 20%. Now that's half the rate in South Africa, which is a feather in the cap of the Western Cape, but more than double the G20 average. So here we are in a situation where the Western Cape, 1 in 5 people of the Western Cape are needlessly unemployed as a result of government policy for a government that the people of the Western Cape have voted against for 30 years. This is surely understandable. And actually, why do we always have to go to race? That's exactly the issue. Isn't South Africa supposed to be a non-racial country? That is one of the things that we're fighting for. We want a non-racial country, and it's all right for the president to talk about, hang on a second, we want non-racialism, but actually we've got more race laws now than at any time during apartheid.
So sorry, Craig, are you saying that the Western Cape has the highest levels of unemployment? The last I checked, we were looking at, I think, Eastern Cape, the Northwest. Is that the numbers that you have, that the Western Cape actually has the highest levels of unemployment?
No, that's not what I said at all. I said South Africa has got 40%, just over 40%, he's 41.6 at the expanded rate, and the Western Cape's at 20. What I said is that the Western Cape is half of South Africa's number because it's better governed, but it's double the average of G20. In other words, it's good, but it's better than the rest of South Africa, but it's still absolutely terrible by any international measure, and that's a result of national government economic policy. Okay,
so the Western Cape doesn't have chronic unemployment compared to other provinces in South Africa?
Well, it's got chronic unemployment. 20% absolutely is
compared to other provinces.
The other provinces are worse.
Okay, cool.
But hear me, it's got chronic unemployment.
Yeah, but when you say we've got chronic unemployment here, that's a suggestion that you're making. So you do understand that there are other provinces actually that are suffering the highest levels of unemployment, far worse than the Western Cape.
But what is the point you're trying to make, Clement? You're trying to suggest that we in the Western Cape should put up with 20% unemployment because actually it's worse in the rest of the country because there it's even worse governed than here. We want to be well governed. You know, Limpopo, with the best will in the world, elected the ANC. KZN elected, or now almost MK. The Eastern Cape elected the ANC. So if they're really badly governed because the national government is enacting terrible economic policy, at least they voted for it. Here in the Western Cape, we didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't.
Well, I'm not suggesting that you have to put up with it. I'm just trying to correct what you're saying so that the viewers don't get the wrong message. When you are creating an impression that you're going to run to the US to engage Trump because you want Cape independence, and one of the issues you are dealing with is the chronic unemployment, the suggestion there is that it is that bad in the Western Cape that it requires another government to intervene. I want the viewers to understand that that's not the case. When you talk about chronic unemployment, that is not in comparison to other countries, to other provinces in the country. And that's similar to the point AfriForum was making about farm murders. Yes, there are farm murders, but the impression they're trying to create is that for some reason white people are under siege, when in fact when you look at the numbers, that is not the case. It's people who live in farms who get killed, who are victims of crime. So I want the viewers to get that. How are you going to move around the Constitution here? Because this doesn't align with our democratic values. We are a democratic society that embraces a singular, non-racial society. So which part of the Constitution, in your understanding, allows for such a cessation from South Africa?
Okay, well, first of all, let's just dispel some myths. We're not a non-racial country. We're a deeply racialized country. We've got 142 race laws. We have BEE, we have affirmative action, we have race quotas in sport. We absolutely are not a non-racial country. We're a deeply racialized country. So let's get that absolutely straight to start off. Now, you asked me where in the Constitution do we get this right from? Well, in a number of places. First and foremost, Section 235, the right of self-determination. The right of self-determination for the South African people as a whole does not preclude other groups, so that there you could start. And you can also go to international law. The right of self-determination is a fundamental principle of international law, which South Africa has repeatedly sworn to uphold since 1994, and the ANC are outspoken supporters of self-determination for Palestine, for the Western Sahara. So the ANC support self-determination. The South African Constitution enables self-determination. So if the Western Cape people come along and say we'd like to enact our right to self-determination, what constitutional barrier exists to stop them?
I mean, if you're so confident that the Constitution allows for it, why haven't you gone straight to the Constitutional Court to see that realized? Have you ever tried that?
Well, what would we go to the Constitutional Court for at this point in time? The first thing we need to do is have a referendum to determine the democratic will of the Western Cape people. The Constitutional Court has certified Section 235. I can talk you through the certification. It's a very significant note, but at this point it's irrelevant because the first step in the process is to establish the democratic will of the Western Cape people, which should happen in a referendum, which the DA promised to call and then went back on their word, with the Constitution allows, and our first port of call is to try and force a referendum referendum on Cape Independence. And actually, that is probably the primary objective that we have going overseas, to raise funding to help us to work towards that referendum and to see if we can get political pressure placed on the Western Cape government to call the referendum, because right now the Western Cape Premier is defeating democracy in the Western Cape by deliberately not calling a referendum that the majority of people in the Western Cape want.
Where in the Constitution, though, does it talk about cessation? Because the Constitution, when it talks about the right to self-determination, it doesn't explicitly define in fact a single section. I'm not seeing anywhere where it talks about cessation. In fact, if anything, it looks at the right of all people to freely determine their political status, to pursue their economic, social and cultural development. Where in that section of the Constitution do you think your call for cessation is justified?
So self-determination is a right that attaches to all people. Secession is the ultimate measure of self-determination. There is no absolute right to independence. There's a right to self-determination, and that becomes context-specific. So what would happen? What would be the legal process here? The Western Cape Premier would call a referendum. If the Western Cape people then vote in favour of Cape independence, the Western Cape Premier or the Western Cape government would then be obliged to negotiate with the South African government for its independence. And then you start to fall into the precedents of international law, which would be the classic precedents would be the Quebec judgment, the ICJ's Kosovo judgment and the UK Scotland judgment, and there's form there which effectively says both those parties must negotiate in good faith, because the Western Cape people have a right to self-determination, which may be exercised in the form of secession or in other forms. But let's remember, lesser forms will be things like devolution. And so for two points on self-determination. First of all, it's an undeniable right. The South African government is prohibited from international law from saying no. You cannot say no to self-determination. And the lowest form of self-determination is autonomy, devolution of powers. Now, here the Western Cape were elected wanting the devolution of police and rail, and the national government is refusing to give the Western Cape devolved powers, even though they've asked for it. So arguably, the national government is already in default of international law by not listening to the Western Cape people. Now, ironically, the Western Cape government isn't pressing this issue. I wish it would. I actually have lobbied long and hard with the Western Cape government to assert the right to self-determination. That's why we wrote the Western Cape People's Bill, because they can claim those things by right. But anyway, that's an aside at this point. We need a referendum. Okay,
cool. We clearly understand that constitution differently, but I'd leave it there, I feel. Did you, because it always feels to me like you probably, let me ask it this way. Did you contest elections?
That's right. Well, so the referendum party contested elections, but we must understand that elections and referendums are very different things. They're both separately in the Constitution because they're completely separate things. So yes, we did contest elections.
Okay, how much support did you get when you contested?
We contested elections to try and force the Western Cape Premier to call a referendum. We didn't contest the elections to hope to get a majority. That was
I hear that, Phil. I want the listeners to understand. So you contested elections. How much support did you get in the province, and how much support did you get nationally?
So look, so we got about 5,100 votes in the Western Cape, and we got about collectively 7,200 unique votes. Outside of in the national ballot, we got about 4,000 votes. So we didn't get enough votes to force the Western Cape government to call a referendum. So at this point in time, that was our first outing. We were a 6-month-old party, and obviously we'll continue with that. But we're using all the means at our disposal to try and get a referendum in the Western Cape.
You didn't scratch the surface. So in percentage point, let me get the viewers to understand. 0.26% of the provincial vote, 0.02% of the national vote. What does that tell you? So if you are an organization that is premised on Cape independence, this is something that you have spoken about as an organization. When you go campaign, you have to seek and want to appeal to the people who can resonate with your message. What does this support base tell you about your message and whether or not it resonates with people of the Western Cape?
Well, look, and I guess here's the question of do you want to know the answer or not? So let me rather go back to you and say, look, what did polling say was going to happen? The overwhelming majority of people in the Western Cape who want Cape independence vote for the DA. That's a fact that's been established in every single poll. So we've got two things that we know from polling. The majority of people in the Western Cape favour a referendum being held. We've had that consistently across all of our polls. And the majority of Cape independence supporters vote for the DA. And what did polling say was going to happen? That all those Cape independence supporters weren't going to vote for us, they were going to vote for the DA. We tried to change that reality and we didn't. But we can't pretend that they don't exist, that they're just voting for the DA.
But why are they not voting for you? If you're a party that wants to see a referendum, if truly what you're claiming is true, that the majority of people in the Western Cape want to see a referendum, you're a party that advocates for that. Why are they not voting for you? You got 0.2% nationally. You got 0.26% provincially. That's a dismal failure. That's a message to you that message you claim resonates clearly doesn't.
No, well, clearly, surely you can understand the difference. So first of all, I'll come back to that point. They are separate things in the Constitution. On an election, you vote across a range of issues for who you want to run your province. I don't blame people for thinking, hang on a second, this small, tiny, 6-month-old party isn't the party that's right for running the Western Cape. We tried to get a protest vote. The majority of people voted for the DA because they thought the DA were the party that was best equipped to run the Western Cape. And that's what they voted for. A referendum is something very, very different. That's why in international law, in international norms, independence questions are decided in a single question referendum, which is not party political. It takes party politics out of it. You don't vote across a range of issues. You vote on one specific issue. Do you want Cape independence or not? That's how it works all around the world, and that's how we want it to work here. And when we poll, we poll consistently. Every single time, the majority of people in the Western Cape want a referendum to be held.
And yet they don't vote for the same party that wants the same referendum. Okay, well, what exactly do you want Donald Trump to do?
So we want to get some financial support so that we can run a more comprehensive campaign so that we can be more effective, and we want the US to place diplomatic pressure onto the Western Cape government to say, hey, you're standing in the way of democracy. And we want you to consult the Western Cape people and allow them to express their democratically will freely, as they should be able to do in a democracy.
Well, the presidency spoke about your citizenship. Just lastly, Phil,
Sure.
You are a permanent resident, right? You're not a citizen yet of this country.
Sure, that's correct, yes.
Is this something that you would do in your birth country of Britain? And how do you respond to people who argue that here's a man who's come from Britain, who's not even a citizen fully of this country yet, and here he is sowing these divisions and wanting to go to another country to claim to represent citizens of this country, and in that process is sowing divisions and wants another government to interfere in our internal affairs?
Well, so as usual, I would say that this is political rhetoric, and I think the fact that the president has chosen to play the man and not the ball speaks volumes. And there's a lot of facts that either he doesn't yet know or he hasn't made clear, including the fact that I'm entitled to citizenship. I'm trying to attain citizenship, and actually I've got a court order which the Department of Home Affairs is in default over around my citizenship. So there are a number of issues there which certainly haven't come out to the light. I don't want to get sidetracked onto those issues. One of the things I think is far more important, because it's not about me. In a referendum, it's about 3.2 million voters. So if you focus on me, you've missed the point. But here the president says, why does this person come to South Africa? Well, the departure point is fundamentally wrong. When I came to South Africa and invested all my life's work and wealth in South Africa before I married a South African, had South African children, set up my businesses here. Ultimately, I came here under Thabo Mbeki, where we had this really well-run country with strong economic growth, low unemployment, and everything was moving forward. After that, we had Jacob Zuma, we had state capture, we had increases in race-based policy. And so the question should be, what on earth has turned this foreign investor who came here and fell in love with this country, somebody who wants Cape Independence, and perhaps the president should just turn the camera around 180 degrees and start asking himself, what am I doing as the president that's making somebody like this guy suddenly get so determined to fight for this issue for his family and other people's family? How badly have I treated his family to make them want to fight like this?
Have you ever thought of going back to Britain at some point if you are so unhappy about how things are being done here, instead of wanting to push a particular province to somehow stop being part of the larger country of South Africa?
Have you ever thought how racist it is for people to keep saying, why, if you don't like it, leave? I'm here. I'm entitled to be here. My wife is South African. She 10th generation. My children were born here. They don't know any other country. They're Afrikaans speaking. They go to an Afrikaans school. So actually, I find it very offensive when people start saying, as soon as I don't like your political views, have you thought of going home? Have you thought of leaving the country, Clement? If you don't like my views, do you want to leave? And am I saying to you, why don't you leave?
Not at all. So if I don't like this country, if I feel like the province that I am part of, somehow I don't want it being part of a larger South Africa, I am going to consider leaving this country instead of trying to force my opinion on people. And I'll say force, Phil, because there's no evidence that suggests that the people have voted that they want a cessation of the Western Cape from South Africa. Hence the question I'm asking you. I honestly don't mean it in an offensive way. I just want to know, is that not a consideration to you if you're so unhappy here? Now you are wanting people to take a political posture of, let's move away from South Africa, when this is a country that we've built that is non-racial, that lives in a constitutional democracy. And if that doesn't serve you, and if that doesn't serve me, nothing stops us from deciding to pack up and leave.
My family are multi-generation South African. I've become South African. This is our home. We're going nowhere. What we want is I'm not trying to force my views on anybody. Remember, I'm calling for a referendum, and I would say to you, I'm willing to have a referendum and allow the people to decide for themselves. It's the government that doesn't want to ask the people. Let's ask them, and then the matter's solved.
Phil Craig, thank you so much for speaking to us on Face the Nation tonight. After the break, how do we navigate these tough diplomatic waters? Pallo Jordan was the chair of the ANC's International Relations Subcommittee. He's going to speak to us. Stay with us here on Face the Nation. Welcome back. So the question we've been asking you tonight is whether you think the president is right to not rush the decision to appoint a new U.S. ambassador, or must the appointment be made speedily? Here are some of your thoughts on X. DN says, I think the president is right and we must give him the space to do his work. We don't have to pressurize him. Bono says the president must take his time. We need a fearless and open-minded ambassador. We need someone who's going to make sure that all the conversations are aligned with the values of our country. It is obviously going to take time to find an ambassador of that caliber. We mustn't rush. Right, those are some of your messages coming through on X. We also have some of your inputs coming through on the voice note line, responding to what should be our government approach given this level of hostility. Do you respond now, and how do you respond? Here's what some of you have said on the voice note line.
Hi, Clement. Good evening. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, I think the president must apply his mind. We don't want to rush things. We don't want to look desperate, because America doesn't have an ambassador here yet. So what's the rush? You're speaking to Ntombi in Joburg. Good evening.
Sam Alekotri Clement Dumela. The interaction between the two countries will always be intact, with or without the ambassador. Sending another ambassador now, that ambassador must be fully schooled by Trump administration, what to do and what not. No one will ever be ambassadorial between the two countries until and unless he is firstly programmed by Trump administration. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you so much for your inputs. Let's move to this now. The presidency has warned formations to avoid further inflaming tensions between South Africa and the United States ahead of expelled Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool's homecoming. The presidency spokesperson Vincent Magwenya said earlier today that the president will also engage the ANC leadership to exercise some restraint when welcoming Rasool back in the country. The former ANC Foreign Relations Committee Chair and veteran Pallo Jordan joins us now via video link. Mr. Jordan, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening.
We are on uncharted waters, maybe troubled waters is the right phrase to use. What is your assessment of South Africa in dealing with this geopolitical crisis, as some call it?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that have to be addressed when we talk about the expulsion of Ambassador Rasool from the U.S. It's an unprecedented action in the first instance. Even at the height of the Cold War, and I lived through those years, I don't remember the United States ever expelling a Soviet ambassador. So this is an extremely radical act on the part of the United States to expel our ambassador. There's that aspect of it. I think then also, in addition to that, there was, to a certain extent, some carelessness on the part of a number of players involved in this. On the part, for example, I think of the think tank that involved Ambassador Rasool in the discussion where he made these remarks. That was a very hasty discussion.
Yeah.
I think anyone who witnessed the inaugural address by President Trump on the 20th of January can testify to the fact that it was clear he had thrown away the playbook of U.S. foreign policy post-1945. He'd thrown away that playbook, that he had picked up another one, an old one, dating back to the early part of the 20th century. The accents in which he spoke, declaring the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, threatening to take Panama back, threatening Canada, threatening to buy or annex Greenland. And then the manner in which he treated
Volodymyr Zelensky.
President Zelensky in the White House, publicly scolding him.
Yeah.
Because if he had wanted to say those things to him seriously, he could have said them in private.
Yeah.
He did it in public because he wanted to humiliate him. And so there were all these signals.
And another signal
where the United States was headed.
Yeah.
So it was, I think, very precipitous to want to discuss United States foreign policy and then involve the ambassador to the United States in that discussion.
Yeah.
That was something very careless. But that having been said, what one must say also is that it's clear, however, that this was not the precipitating factor. Marco Rubio refused to attend the G20, which was being hosted by South Africa, which was a signal of hostility even then, long before Ambassador Rasool made these remarks. So we must look at these things in that overall context.
Yeah. So how do we respond then? In fact, one of the things you didn't mention there is also about how President Trump has dealt with the Middle East crisis, where he tells people in Gaza, don't go back there. He wants to build some kind of a resort there. These are people's homes. And he says, well, I want to build something there. We want them to go into Jordan, into Egypt, into neighboring countries and not go back there. But how do you think South Africa then should respond? Because all of the examples you've given...
What I'm saying, and you see, is that when we look at the expulsion of Ambassador Rasool, we have to factor all those things in. That the Trump administration has decided that the playbook that they are going to use is one from the early 20th century, one of outright imperialism, where you say, for example, that we built the Panama Canal. You know, I mean, that is such an exaggeration. In the first place, the Panama Canal, the man who designed it was de Lesseps, Ferdinand de Lesseps, a Frenchman, who incidentally was a socialist. People don't know that. Secondly, a goodly part of the labor force who built the Panama Canal were people who came from the Caribbean and Panama itself. Of course, there were Americans involved as well. But to say that we built it, I mean, it's such an outright exaggeration. So, and then on top of that, this outright outlandish claim that it's owned by China. You know, things like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, there was a tone to President Trump's speech which said that is the playbook from which he is operating now. Outright imperialist power. And we want Greenland. Now, you either sell it to us or we're going to take it from you. Yeah. I mean, he said it just the other day. It's going to be ours one way or the other.
Now, the question is, how do we then respond, Mr. Jordan? Because
of the United States. Now, it is in that context then that you have to look at what has happened between South Africa and the United States.
What's the best way to respond?
That conflict was almost inevitable if you're going to if you're using that playbook.
What is the best way to respond? Because when we negotiate, they may want South Africa to make some concessions. So do you sit and draw the line, or are these the people you must negotiate with?
Drawing a line. It's the question of just recognizing certain realities in the world. I think no one was anticipating what President Trump has done. The United States foreign policy was based on a number of alliances. For example, NATO, right? He has thrown that out of the window.
So what do we do, Mr. Jordan?
Right? So you see, now what I'm saying is that you have to rethink almost everything about geopolitics now. The geopolitics of the world, he's rewriting it. And we have to rethink it.
Should we be prepared to compromise on some of our positions?
It's not a question of compromise or not compromise. You have to recognize certain realities. There are certain realities you just have to face up to. The United States under Trump has decided that it is going to be an imperialist power and it's going to act unilaterally. It doesn't care about the alliances that were built after 1945. It doesn't care about its relations with its immediate neighbors, right? A whole number of, so you have to rethink everything about geopolitics, is what I'm saying, which is why I'm saying the think tank that encouraged Rasool to speak about this was being careless. Yeah. It's too early. We have to rethink geopolitics completely. It's far too early to be speculating about U.S. policy at this point in time.
Okay, here's the question then. If we have to rethink, of course, geopolitics, how should government then deal with Ambassador Rasool's replacement? And I'm asking this strategically. What kind of a person should this government think about?
At this point, move slowly. Right? There will be a whole number of citizens that will be coming, one way or the other, from the United States. Right? Whether they are going to maintain this hostile posture, because it is a very hostile posture. They never did this to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. They never did it. So this is an extremely hostile action. We must read it as such and make no mistake about it.
Yeah. And of course, as you read it like that, as a hostile thing, you have to find a way to respond.
That's the reality you have to come to terms with.
Yeah.
And this is an outright hostile act, and it's following up what Marco Rubio had done before that, which is to refuse to come to the G20, which was being hosted by South Africa.
Pallo Jordan, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I really appreciate your time. After the break, we're going to wrap up the show with a conversation about what's been unfolding between the DRC President Felix Tshisekedi and the Rwandan President Paul Kagame. They met in Qatar this week. Are those talks bearing any fruit? We'll chat about that when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back. The African Union has welcomed talks between the presidents of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The body commended the two countries for their commitment to dialogue and peaceful resolution of the crisis in the eastern DRC. Last week, SADC announced its phased withdrawal of troops from the area. Dr. Faith Mabera is a postdoctoral research fellow at Wits University and joins us now via video link. Thank you so much for making time for us, Dr. Mabera. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement, and good evening to the viewers.
So I see the AU is now commending these peace talks between the DRC president and the Rwandan president. But this meeting wasn't even facilitated by anyone on this continent. It was facilitated by Qatar. Is this an indication of the failure of this continental body, the AU, and even regional bodies like SADC?
Indeed, Clement, the talks that were convened in Qatar were very much a surprise element, especially because all eyes were averted towards Luanda, Angola, where we were actually expecting to see convening of talks between the conflict parties, and hopefully at some point we had hoped that the M23 would also be roped in, but they turned down engagement in that particular sort of venue and platform, and instead we saw a very quick turnaround, a very quick convening in Doha by Qatar. And interestingly, the talks in Qatar were significant, particularly because it marked the first time that we saw President Tshisekedi and President Kagame meeting face-to-face since the talks that they were supposed to have in December fell through. So in that sense, it was the first face-to-face meeting. It was, of course, a venue outside the continent, and it speaks to a very interesting point in the conflict, particularly not only with reference to movements on the ground, but also a lot of the other dynamics related to the SADC mission mandate being ended. We are also seeing this rapid offensive by M23 and their continued capture of large swaths of territory. Yeah.
So there's no doubt that this is an important step towards regional stability, is it not? I mean, these men didn't even want to meet at some point. I think Felix Tshisekedi has famously said in the past, I'll only meet Paul Kagame in heaven. How progressive are they? I mean, we don't know from the statement that Qatar released, there are no really fundamental things that were resolved on except to say we are going to keep on talking. But is this going to work if the M23 are not part of the negotiations? Because as you said, they don't want to be part of even that Luanda process. So is it even possible for us to have a diplomatic solution in the Eastern DRC without the M23 being part of that conversation?
That's $1 million question, Clement, on account of the fact that the number of ceasefires that had been negotiated, particularly since the outset of the conflict in late 2021, we've seen several ceasefires being violated by both parties, and especially because the ceasefires will only hold for a certain time, but as soon as realities on the ground evolve either in favor of one of the other parties, then we see continued and the prolonging of the conflict. And that's the question that we are asking, particularly because this time around, the M23 advancement has really come at a time when there's been marked differences in the strategic environment. They seem to be pretty much well-armed, well-equipped. Their lightning offensive is proof that they have very powerful backers, allegedly the involvement of Rwanda in supplying them with both financial and military support, which has aided their offensive. But even interestingly, as they take on territory, they've shown signs of intent to actually establish state-like administration, given by the levels of control that they are starting over the territories that in towns that they've seized. So that's the question that we're going to have, and especially the condition of talks with M23, particularly as a legitimate conflict party, it has been a major sticking point. That is what sort of upended the talks that were supposed to be held under the Luanda process. On one hand, the DRC government has refused to engage them and accord them any sense of equivalence. On the other hand, Rwanda has been asserting that the only way perhaps to actually move the needle in terms of engagement is for the DRC government to actually talk directly to the M23. So that continues to be a sticking point. Meanwhile, reports are emerging on the ground that the violence continues. In fact, as of this week, we've seen the capture of the key town of Walikale, which is the most western front, showing that indeed the M23 are continuing to amass large amounts of territory.
Yeah, I mean, as they make those advancements, I just think it's going to be virtually impossible to somehow find a solution without them being part of those talks. Dr. Faith Mabera, thank you so much for your insights. I truly appreciate your time this evening on Face the Nation. All right, let's wrap up with some of your comments that have come through on Twitter, some comments that have come through on the voice note line as well. We've been asking you whether you think the president is right not to rush this decision to appoint a new U.S. ambassador, or must the appointment be made speedily? A lot of you are saying that the president has got to take his time. Some of you are saying that we have no luxury of time as well. But then we'll continue that conversation then on social media as we are out of time. Thank you so much for watching the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday at 8 p.m. Have a good evening. Cheers.